So today on the settee, we're going to invite you to step into the ways that neighbourhood transitions is fundamentally happening by reimagining in our homes, our streets and our neighbourhoods, and how it's been implemented, governed and maintained by the people. In today's conversation, we'll be exploring the connections between the built environment, health, and how policy and social ecological systems within these play out. And that will be with Josh from Centric Lab, and from our Civic Square team, we have Kavita, who will also be joining us on this panel as well. Welcome. I'm just going to hold 1 second to see if anyone else is going to come and sit back down. Okay, that was long enough. 1 second. All right, so let's start. So I just want to give a little bit of concept, a little bit more of the wider context around the what is, what if, and so what. So we've kind of sectioned out how we're exploring this work through kind of the what is, like what's happening right now, who's doing stuff right now, what does it look like at this present moment in kind of neighbourhood transitions. And then the next bit is the what if, which takes us into a bit of a dreaming space. And that dreaming space is really kind of important because it kind of can catapult us into the so what and into action. So I'm going to start with my first question. So can we kind of start, it's a big question to start with, I'm sorry, but I really wondered if we could kind of start with getting a wider kind of context of the what is, but with like a focus on land histories, focus on kind of power and how that has kind of been very entangled and knotty and entrenched with like colonial legacies. But how has this kind of impacted the built environment and how we kind of view our own health? Josh, I'm going to pass on to you. We'll start with the big questions, and they don't get any smaller, but I think it's really important to kind of hold all of this kind of complexity.
Thank you, Zaz. So I'm going to try and summarise 1,500 years of history in a 2.5-minute articulation. To answer your question, we do have to actually go back to look at the origins of feudalism. So I wasn't kidding, 1,500 years. The 5th century was around the era that feudalism began. And it was a time in Britain where the first carving up of land started to take place. Feudal also comes from a word of fief, which is also related to property. So even in the very beginning, we have a word that defines around property, this sense of owning something and the ability to extract from it. And I'm going to quote, and I'm actually going to do quite a few quotes, and I'm going to give the sources, because something we believe at Centric Lab is to not own something that's definitely not ours, and to cite that this is a long movement of people advocating for the justices in whatever field it represents. So Jason Moore writes in an essay called The Crisis of Feudalism that feudalism exhausted soil and the labour and the power from which it derived its revenues, rendering the population vulnerable to disease. And this was also the era in which we saw the Black Death emerge. So over a near sort of 1,000-year period, we had feudalism kind of cannibalize itself by destroying the people and their main sources of income, but by tending to the land in an extractive manner, which then kind of gave the boost to the concepts around colonialism. Because as land and labour were broken here in the UK, it was the ability for new and fertile land and labour to be exploited for a self-owned gain. And so the methods were taken and compounded in multiple ways. And something that he talks about more is the idea that as the power left the lords who were based in the UK, the kind of landlords, people who had seceded or were given land by the crown, their power was very much defined by a property boundary. But as colonialism expanded, the ideas of supply chains were far more important, because it was no longer a defined and definitive point of lands that people were working with. They were working in supply chains. And so you had merchants, you had bankers, and effectively capitalists, those who were becoming the sources of power in that era. And something he goes on to say that it's no longer, we start to see really that this is, from this standpoint, the ongoing crisis, also the origins of capitalism, may shed light to today's ecological crisis. So this sits alongside a justification. Like, how do you get away with this? How do you actually get away, create and convince your own people that there are ways to do this? A lot of it was also the drawing of characters, and I don't mean to crap on religion, but drawing of the characters and painting the characters of people like Jesus Christ as a sort of very white Anglo-Saxon or Nordic-looking man, are very inaccurate terms. And so you often see the kings, in particular, of those sort of Middle Ages era, always reflective in looking like the characters of Jesus Christ, in particular, that they were deigned by gods to be to have a divine right to land. And there's one thing that, for example, John Locke writes, and he was a philosopher through the sort of the later Middle Ages, and he writes, through the earth and all inferior creatures. And these are small things, but they're very symptomatic of a decision and a hierarchy formed between man and land. And as we know, that science is political, it is never neutral. It also gave way to sort of how scientific concepts such as the permission to pollute, where specific quantities of contaminants are allowed in the legal bodies of water, human bodies, air, and soil. And it's based on a concept of assimilative capacity. Now, I'm going to read from a book which I recommend everyone to read, called Pollution is Colonialism. It's by a Newfoundland in occupied Canada based researcher called Max Liberaron. Scott, who's in the audience, has read this, and it is heavy. It is an intense read, but it is foundational. So I want to give props to that as a recommendation and to read. And I just want to express what assimilative capacity is. Let me get to here. So it was assimilative capacity was developed by two engineers, and it's kind of the Streeter-Phelps equation, as it came to be known. Not only became a hallmark of water pollution science and regulation, but also contained within it the theory of pollution, that a moment existed when water could not purify itself, and that moment could be measured, predicted, and properly called pollution, and self-purification became known as assimilative capacity, a term of art in both environmental science and policy making that refers to the amount of waste material that may be discharged into receiving water without causing deleterious ecological effects. Now, the book goes on to kind of discredit that this was a very convenient way of articulating you could put things in water, and actually nature had its way of overcoming that. But that is not an actual legitimate form, and this was the seedings of why we have things like the Tory party allowing sewage to be dumped into our riverways and seas, because there is a concept that, it's big enough and it can maintain and it can rehabilitate. But it's a chosen decision. It is an epistemological decision to say our decisions are greater than that of those around us. So to kind of summarize, the idea that organic compounds that were put into the water soon became compounds, then it soon became plastics and sewage, as I've just mentioned. So we have this intersection of illegitimate land rights combining with sort of illegitimate science, as well as the illegitimacy basis of racism and colonialism coming together to contaminate sort of air, water, and land, eroding nature's biome, so its own actual sort of health barometer, the sort of the biome or the microbiome, or all the microorganisms that exist in a given environment. So for an example, in our own guts, our own gut microbiome, there are about 1.5 trillion microorganisms made up by your interrelation to the world around you, from the forests you go to the microfibers you breathe in. So it's an expansive area. So not only by weakening nature's microbiome, we're also weakening ours. Because if we feed off the land and the places around us, we are bringing down our own capacities to respond, which is bringing down our abilities and our immune strengths, as well as it is our gut influencing our metabolic reactions, which through the central nervous system, and a study that our team at Centric Lab focus on within the fields of neuroscience, which is the HPA axis, which is a full sort of body and brain axis that helps regulate immune, metabolic, but also endocrine systems, that we start to see the influences on things like our hormonal systems. And all of these stand together, that it's no surprise that we have just growing non-communicable diseases at the same scale of the pollution that goes into our land, water, and air. So that's kind of a quick summary of 1,500 years of how we've kind of got to today, with the history of why the built environment is regulated in the way it does, why we have the preference and the power of property deeds over voices, and ultimately, if architecture is climate in this way, why the pollution into our land, water and soil not only is eroding nature's capacity to regulate itself, it's causing a dysregulation of those systems, which is the underpinning for climate change. So it's not only influencing it's not only impacting the new pathogens that may come from nature as it evolves, but it's also pointing out the fragility in our own built environments as we try to fend off shocks that are going to be coming from climate change. So that's kind of, before getting even down to the building level, that's the kind of setting that I think is important to acknowledge, that there is an illegitimate theory structure right at the beginning, that if we're going to work our way out of this, we have to start unpacking that and rebuilding from that. So hopefully that wasn't too long.
Thank you. Kavita, is there anything that you want to add to that, or that touches kind of on these like power kind of structures, or like land histories, or our kind of colonial legacy? Is there anything you want to add to that?
I'm loving this like pass the one mic action around. It's great. Keeps us dynamic. Obviously, Josh, thank you so much for that like really amazing, expansive introduction. I think it really helps set the scene. And my knowledge base isn't quite as historical. But I will just add that there's so many ways that we can see this playing out in our realities. And part of that is also very interesting, that you spoke about how we have these like false sciences that say that, well, actually like nature will find a way to recreate like ways to deal with these issues. And we can see that happening with like all of the oil pollution that happens and in through leakages and leachates. And we can see that like there's a lot of illegitimate I don't know if it's illegitimate, but it legitimizes the pollution to keep happening. It's science that claims that there are other microorganisms that will continue to eat and like digest all of the pollutants that like happen through leaks, and that just like reaffirms and like allows for the pollution to keep happening. We can see that like through studies that are happening in landfills, that that now that there's this amazing new like bacteria that's been discovered that eats plastics, and it's another way to keep saying landfills are okay. And whether these microorganisms do those things it's almost like by the by, because that needs to happen regardless, but also our reduction in the ways that we are damaging the planet and hurting ourselves in the process need to stop happening too. And part of the just like on some of the colonial legacies that have happened through that power structure also are completely like invisible to us. So one thing that I found through studying the data portrait of place that we did with Civic Square's donut economics work was to find out that the impacts of colonialism on health are so vast and so extreme that, for example, in South Asia, there were so many famines that were like introduced as like strategic like vessels to control power, and all of the food that was grown in one of the major food baskets of the world was redirected to European countries. And as a result of that, so many people became starvation adapted. What that means today is that South Asians are far more likely to get diabetes, far more likely to have cardiovascular disease, far more likely to have compounding illnesses, and also have like extra fat reserves which detriment our health. And the weird thing is that like we're living in this era where we know all of these things and we still can't do anything about them. The way that we reinforce how health then gets managed and manifested, it becomes the thing that you have to take on. Like, it's my fault that I'm predisposed to get diabetes. It's my parents' fault for all of these things, and these things don't disappear after one generation. Sometimes, depending on the illness, can get compounded generationally. So there's layers to this, to the holding of power and the ecological and social destruction that we can't even measure or see, or like will know for generations to come. So that's a part of the what is.
Thank you for that, Kavita, and even touching on that, this like aspect of the individual. It's about the individual. Well, this is what's happening with me, and that's just it, and that's what's happening to my health, and that's it. But actually, as you both kind of mentioned, there are so many like histories that have actually kind of made those things become a reality. And at some point in the conversation, we will kind of go into that too. So I really want to just kind of shift a little bit into the what if. So I just want to give a little bit of context around this as well. So at Civic Square, we kind of explore our work through three matters. So we've got like the everyday matters, we've got the dream matter, and we've got the dark matter. The everyday is kind of as it sounds, right? Like the thing every day that happens, like what happens 5 minutes outside of your door, what happens like 10 minutes away from from where you live, and that's about kind of like what resources we have, what buildings are there, and all this kind of connectedness that kind of makes up your everyday. And then we go into the which I guess touches on like the built environment as well. And then obviously we go into the dream matter, and that is the what if, like, you know, what if we could be resourced, what if we could be thriving, what if we could be kind of deeply connected with each other. And then we have the dark matter, and the dark matter is that kind of bit that starts to look at policy, that starts to look at structures, what's happening kind of underneath the iceberg, what is that kind of systematic aspect of our lives that, like Kavita kind of mentioned, this like invisible layer. So the next kind of set of questions are kind of like straddling all of those areas. So just to kind of bear that in mind when, whatever you take away from this today, to think about some of this stuff in that way. So I wanted to kind of get into what does it kind of like look like to explore what a more distributed and decentralized healthcare system like could look like. So firstly, could you both maybe kind of make comment on what our healthcare infrastructure could look like in the future, and through the lens of like if it was more imaginative, if communities and people were kind of had more autonomy over their health. Josh, can I start with you? Yeah, perfect.
Thank you, Zaz. Big question, but love it. I'm going to flip it on its head slightly, and not to be difficult, but it's like almost positioning that what does good healthcare look like? It's almost the ability for a child to be eating the soil. And I know that seems a little bit mad, but that's actually what good healthcare looks like. Because we'd know then if that a child could eat the soil outside, we'd know that it's not full of contaminants. We'd know it's not full of contaminants and petrochemicals. We'd know that it's not full of contaminants from the air, as particulate matter filled with heavy metals that come out from industrial polluters waft through the atmosphere and get brought down and into the ground. We'll also know that the rivers haven't been contaminated with sewage and other forms of artificial chemicals that are then influencing things like the water base and other animals that feed off it. And all of a sudden, we see that, as we were saying before, nature's biome is also making us healthy. It's a form of healing in that way. I don't know if people are familiar with, there's a concept called the blue zones, which is by a sort of a writer, traveller, a guy called Dan Buettner, I think his name is. And he went around the world to try and find where people living the longest lived. And he identified that, and they're called centenarians, the highest proportions of centenarians are people living over 100. And he found for men that it was in Sardinia, and for women it was in Okinawa, in the southern archipelago of Japan. So apologies for the gender binariness of it, but that was his resource. And he put it down to like all these great qualities of life. Look at the food they're eating. Look at the fact that they can socialize and they can do all of these things, and they're near the sunshine. And you're like, yes, that's good, but it doesn't actually kind of address the other sides of health, which was, I put forward, how many petrochemical factories are down the road from them? How many plastics are they engaging with on a daily basis? How many diesel vehicles are in front of them as they try to go about their daily lives? And so there's this question of, are they healthy because it's just they happen to make their own olive oil, or the fact that they're not being broken down by pollutants and other forms of either environmental or psychosocial stresses that are actually causing their body to dysregulate from this chronic exposure to these stresses, everything from financial insecurity to crime to prejudice, marginalizations and racisms, which are all forms of stress and pressure. And there's this concept called the weathering hypothesis, which came out of the United States of America by now Professor Arlene T. Geronimus. And her kind of question was, why is it that women who were racialized as African American and black were having disproportionate worse health outcomes? And the question wasn't, well, is it because they're black, which is what you were referring to, the idea that like, oh, the eugenics idea of like, oh, you're South Asian, you're more predisposed to it. It's like, no, you've actually been put into a condition where you're more predisposed to it. And so the results of the weathering hypothesis, and that then became the weathering effect, was that the chronic marginalizations and structural disadvantages that were put upon, in particular, single, often working mothers who were African American, that itself was a stressor. It was a depleting of their internal resources and causing complications to, as I said before, things like metabolic, immune and endocrine related issues. So again, we have to ask ourselves that question of, is it the fact that like, oh, we have good food, or is it the environments that we're in? So if I kind of skip forward a little bit, what is it to live in a good place? What does a healthcare system look like? Yes, you can eat the soil and kind of, but how do we get there? And I think that kind of communities having that level of agency to create that, I think are kind of earmarked in three ways. The first is arguably a greater voice. That has to be the greater voice where the power of the human voice is greater than that of the property deed. And I think later on, I'm going to give an example of where that has had a really deleterious impact. The second is also recognizing, and this is when we're starting to get into the more practical policy, like how do we imagine and create our ways out of this, that we have policy and institutionalized systems that are incredibly siloed. And actually something that we're collectively working on and we'll be working on together is the idea of, I believe that through communities leading research more and more about the relationships between health and place, that we're going to see a more interconnectedness between departments to recognize the fact that like urban planning is healthcare. And at the moment it's not. There is the healthcare system, and then there is the Department for Environmental, Food and Rural Affairs, and then there is the Ministry of Homes, Communities, Land, whatever the hell it's called at the moment. And so there we have the awareness of, okay, how does research then scale up to change the way these things are operating? And lastly, I think this is really important, that the actual healthcare system itself was able to kind of like unshackle and take itself away from the kind of colonial era of health, as in man-woman health. The idea that our health, we were engineered, the healthcare system was to get us back to productive capacity. And meaning that also we have to kind of rid itself of issues like the BMI index, which is steeped in eugenics and racist theories about what the ideal body looked like, and it happened to always generally look like a 6'1" white man who's generally quite skinny. And I think also the other part is to recognize within that, how does the healthcare sector detangle itself from that history, is to move away from the gender binary. And as many cultures around the world do recognize these transness and non-binariness of peoples in many forms. And that it's, and the fact that their lived experiences are pathways to health. And right now, I mean, a lot of what I'm saying right now is actually on a platform we've got called Urban Health Council, where there's a lot of research that's been put together. And if you wanted to look at, for example, what I'm talking about now, there are a couple of pieces around gender health and power, as well as from care to healing. And the idea that the concept of even the lived experience of people who identify as trans and live their lives as a trans person at the moment is very much characterized as like, oh, you're trans, right, you're transitioning. So how do we deal with your transition to A or to B, rather than the lived experience of that self? So we move from this idea of going from care to healing. So we look at the land, we look at the kind of the structures that we're working with, we're moving into healing, but healing is bidirectional. And at the moment, we don't have that bidirectional level. We just have the top-down hierarchy. A couple stats to kind of underpin that. Only 3% of doctors are people who identify living with a disability. So again, we have this question around disability justice and how that influences the kind of the medical and healthcare systems. Equally, less than 1% of those who identify as trans or non-binary work within the system. So there is a huge movement of how we have to kind of scale up that way. And the last element of that is that we have a system that doesn't kind of push people out. And there is a beauty to this kind of anecdote or this case study, but it's also come from a place of pain or trauma, that a system that recognized all of our beingness, we wouldn't have had the black-led ballrooms of New York in particular in the 1970s and 80s that were home for those who were identifying as they're sort of not their like birth assigned gender in that way, but that was a form of self-care, self-preservation. They were forced into the situation. There was beauty in that. I'm sure most of us have watched Pose and laughed and cried and wanted to dance along, but it was from pain and suffering that people were forced into that. And so a system that recognized a beingness, we wouldn't have had beauty that came from a place of trauma. And lastly, the idea that healthcare wasn't based on our relationship to capital. It was based on our ability to heal in symbiosis with one another. And it's a very simple message, but again, what is the message that's coming from top to bottom of what is it to be healthy? It's to be at work often, rather than to be. End of my TED Talk.
I just wanted to add just a comment to that, actually, Josh. Thank you for really taking us into the depths there as well. And I think something for me that's just stood out as someone who's non-binary, like as someone who's queer, as someone who's black, like with it, when you're living in multiple like intersex, there are so many moments where, for example, the healthcare system, like it's almost like isn't at the point where it can understand your lived experience and then go, oh, okay, and there's all these other things happening all at once too. And I think there's something really like important about that, actually, because we are impacted so much, like everyone is impacted so much on like just our like built environment, our relationships. All of these things are so intertwined with then how our body is even able to take us through to the next day, right? So yeah, thank you for just like kind of making comment on that as well. And also, yeah, out of so many painful, traumatic spaces have come like real beauty and deep community. And I don't mean like community in like like everyone, but also like community in the sense of like this real weaving together of interactions and weaving together of kind of experience as well. So thank you for that. Kavita, can I pass over to you if you got anything that you want to add to Josh's amazing TED Talk? I'm sure you do. I know you do.
Oh, pass the parcel. Yeah, I think that in the question of like what possible healthcare could exist, for me, there's a couple of layers I think are really important, because yes, we talk about how healthcare is like hyper individualized, but at the same time, like people's marginalized identities end up becoming the thing that gets weaponized within that individual system. So it's a bit like, it's another way of like keeping the power in what the ideal person and like who the system is even designed for is. But then there's also the layer of like the system isn't even working for the people that work within the system as well. Like we are seeing doctors, junior doctors, midwives, like nurses. Everybody is on strike because the system is just like completely working as it's been designed to work, I guess. Like it's being designed in this way that is incredibly oppressive and incredibly alienating. So there's like all of these like experiences that people who are like seeking support will like experience further violence, and then also the people that are working within the system that are doing the job that they deeply think is based in care aren't even able to provide that care. And it's this in this individual like framing that I think that it would be great if there was like a systemic approach to healthcare and that keeps people as a collective in connection to like our ecosystems as well, because like you were saying, Josh, like a lot of the time many of the like conditions that we end up suffering from are direct results of the conditions that we like are living within. And I think when we were talking earlier, we spoke a lot about how like the re-understanding of our bodies in connection to our ecologies is something that we will inherently like. I mean, and if anybody like goes on a walk in nature, like you can physiologically feel yourself in tune with things. So when we then think about like what healthcare systems look like and how we can build things that like engage that sensation, then there's got to be a way that we are recognizing the connections that we inherently have to our wider ecosystems. We are not separate from nature. We are it, and creating these barriers to being in communion with all of the other species that we are a part of is incredibly important. I watched this TikTok once, and Viva la revolution of every part of this, right? And there was someone that talked about how the concept of like pronouns kind of confused them because they are a them, not necessarily because they're non-binary, but because there's multiple organisms that live within us anyway, on us, on our eyelashes, in our stomachs, in like the air that we breathe, and even in that, we know that we're more than just an individual. We are a collective, and yeah. That's all that I've got to build on. What an amazing answer you gave earlier, Josh.
I think it's just really important in how like both of your perspectives have just kind of like come together in this like this way of kind of like, yeah, we're part of an ecosystem, right? Like we're part of an ecosystem of knowledge, we're part of an ecosystem of like experience, and it is beautiful when we actually get to be in these conversations and hear that too. And that takes me on to my next question, which is about ecosystems. Okay, so what if we moved away from, which you've kind of mentioned, the individual kind of healthcare outcomes to a more of a ecosystem of understanding and like what the impacts are on our health? Like what do you think that looks like? Because I know that in lots of ways it's happening and like it exists, but what have you seen, and what does that mean? Because I'm quite interested in how we get to that point where we're constantly learning about each other as well, and that knowledge we're not just learning things about our health because something has happened and you have to learn a new set of terminology for like yourself or for like a family member, but actually what happens when we're in a space of learning and understanding kind of outside of that. Are you ready, Josh? Are you ready? Should we switch it up? Kavita, do you want to go first? Uh-oh.
Are you sure?
You go for it.
Thank you. So moving from the individual, I think it's interesting when we think about the individual health, there's an example that we continually refer to in our work, and it was, and I say our work, a lot of this is led by my partner Araceli, who is currently in New York at the moment, visiting family, but she's the sort of, she's a neuroscientist and lead researcher at Centric, and one of the things that really stuck to her was during the pandemic, there was a poster that was put out by the NHS of a quite large racialized black woman who was holding, it was a green background, and she was holding a bowl, and in that bowl was salad. And the headline said, "I'm doing my bit to protect myself from COVID," because the stories at the time was like, oh, if you have diabetes or obesity or another comorbidity, that would increase the risk of contracting and having a severe problematic relationship from the virus. And this, it was so wrong in so many ways. But the way I'll check that is we actually met the stylist on that shoot completely separately, and we were talking about this. And she said that actually that person was a jiu-jitsu instructor. But of course, she was portrayed as an unhealthy, unfit person just because she had a larger frame than others. And so again, this is putting that like, oh, you are shamed into your body size and you are the problem with that. When in reality, this lady was an athlete, just not necessarily a marathon runner. And it's just this mind-boggling relationship that we look at health through effectively the weight gain aspect rather than how that person is existing within broader systems. So the three ways that we kind of look from the individual to the ecological, I've mentioned before about nature, and that is about the microbiome and the actual quality of land and how we are nurturing land. I think something I didn't say, which I really probably should have is like on the what if, like what if we had a healthcare system? We'd see ecologists like our friends Dr. Jake Robinson, who is an ecologist specializing in the microbiome, that he would, and many of his colleagues would be the people in charge with restoring land. They're actually deeply understanding what is land and how do we rehabilitate it. So we've kind of covered nature, but then we've also got our built, and I think there's, I'll put this to a point I made earlier about the interconnectedness. So in 2025, there's a law coming into effect where property owners are letting out a property, a home. If it has an energy performing certificate of below a C, they're not allowed to lease that property and they've got to pay to do it up. So you think, actually, good, we're going to kind of retrofit homes. You think, okay, that's great. But as what recently happened over the past 5 years, where they decided, the government, to take away the mortgage deduction allowance from buy-to-let landlords, which meant that they could no longer deduct the costs against it, so their earnings actually went down. You saw a lot of buy-to-let landlords sell up. They could either sell to those who could handle that with economies of scale, or they sent to homeowners, which is an aim of, in particular, the Conservatives, to have home ownership. It's what Thatcher brought in well-meaning intention, but a very clear direction of land ownership, people owning. There's still this concept. So when we look at this idea of retrofitting homes, you can't do that. What's going to happen? And I think we have that kind of risk analysis where we go, well, actually, we're likely to see these homes are either going to be they're most likely going to be sold to people as a home owner. So where is that renter going to live? Where are the families and the peoples who rent homes who can't afford a £750,000 apartment to live in London or any other major city? We know from generally our knowledge is about socioeconomics and demographics, those who are going to be the worst impacted and most affected are those who are racialized or minoritized and marginalized in many forms. And so the idea that ecological health, this ecosystemic health, that a policy like that is healthcare, because where are people going to live? Are they going to live in illegal homes now? Are they going to live in mouldy homes, etc.? And I think I think we're getting a sign that that's kind of, I'll sort of wrap up this point, but that is where we start to see an ecosystemic point of health, is that it is not just the idea that we go for a run together, it's we recognize the policies that are around us that dictate the situations we're forced into that lead to our health. So I'll stop there, and Kavita, would you like to follow on?
Thank you, Josh. We'll try and make it snappy. I just wanted to also touch on like how we can start thinking about what it means to take some of these beautiful concepts and like beautiful like revolutionary ideas out, and because I think we have this shared vision of what a just transition could look like, and it means something to all of us in various different ways. But so with this shared philosophy, we also know that we have like a whole set of skills that we need to develop. We have a whole lexicon that we need to build. We have a whole bunch of different strengthening of tools and engagement practices that we need to start co-creating. And that's something that we're hoping to do with Centric Lab quite deeply. And we know that all of these things are possible. We have people that can come together as peers. And we had a peer-to-peer program last year that started to prototype some of these ideas. And we know that the movement building that came from that was really powerful. What we're hoping to do is to then start thinking about ways that we can start pushing some of these practices, ideas, and ways of engaging these concepts and tools into the future is to really start democratizing some of these knowledges. And creating ways that accelerates the practice of these journeys, because that's the way that we'll start having people acting with agency, and what it means to then take ownership over the systematic disempowerment that we currently engage in our health with. We tend to say, okay, well, hey, health is something that I need to go to a doctor for, to get assigned a prescription for, to get a medication for. But there are certain things that we'll be able to start pushing back on. And I think that that's something that we're going to try and develop. And if anybody is interested, then just come and give me or Josh a shout. But yeah, I think very, very excited to prototype some of these things. And we don't necessarily have answers or absolute correct ways of doing things, but we're definitely trying to figure out what can we actually do with all of these revolutionary, beautiful ideas that amazing scholars have built on for a long time, and many of these concepts have come from the work that we've done with our Done economics work, but they definitely translate out and go into wider systems and systemic solutions that we hope to see. That's all we have time for, I think. So I'll pass back to you. Thank you for hearing me out.
This conversation has been so amazing, and we've spoken like so much that the time is just kind of like ticked by. But I would encourage anyone who's here in the room to please chat with Josh, chat with Kavita as they're like hovering around in the space. Sorry, I'm just putting it out there. And anyone that is listening, please go and have a look at the work of Centric Lab. The website is thecentriclab.com. So please go and have a look at their work, and particularly something that we didn't get to touch on, but it's the Urban Health Council. Go and check it out. Go and like have a look at what is happening and how we're kind of going into the so what. And as Kavita mentioned, there's like a really amazing peer-to-peer collaboration project like coming up. So please kind of keep up to date with all of that as well, because we want as many people to be a part of this, and especially in the way that we want to distribute knowledge. And Josh, you've got a quote for us, haven't you?
I just want to anchor what you said, Zaz, in a quote from The Brilliant Pedagogy of the Oppressed. For precisely this reason, people who would normally be considered objects of that investigation should act as co-investigators. The more active an attitude men and women, take in regard to the exploration of their thematics, the more they deepen their critical awareness of reality, and in spelling out those thematics, take possession of that reality. And that's exactly what we're going to be expanding on the Urban Health Council with you guys. So I just felt that really summed up what a knowledge infrastructure is and what we're going to be building out, so that we all have these and can develop these solidarity narratives to kind of get ourselves out of this mess and build our healing futures. So thank you for letting me have the last minute.
Thank you so much for both of you for being in this conversation today. Thank you everyone who's listening. Thank you everyone who's here in the room too. And I'm going to pass back over to Khadija. But thank you all.